Hello. This week is Parshas Chayei, and the Torah Or in Chayei has approximately 3 Maamarim. We are going to learn the final Maamar in Chayei, which is the Maamar Vayeiztei Yitzchok Lasuach Basada. It's actually quite a short Maamar, and as I've learned in my preparing, I couldn't find another Maamar with the same beginning from any of the other Rabbeim. I could be wrong, but I did try to find another Maamar with the same beginning. Although in the Rebbe's Ha'aras V'Tziyunim, in the back of the Torah Or, he references a variety of other Maamarim that talk about a similar topic, Mishnah and Braisa, as you'll find out soon, that our Maamar does not address. So this is a Maamar about Torah. And specifically, it's a Maamar about levels in Torah Shebal Peh itself. According to Chassidishe and Kabbalah, there are 3 qualitative dimensions to the Torah. The Luchos Abris, the tablets, which correspond to Ein Sof. Torah Shebiksav, which corresponds to Atzilus. And Torah Shebal Peh, which corresponds to Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah. This Maamar discusses only Torah Shebal Peh and talks about the difference between Mishnah and Braisa, as you'll see as the Maamar unfolds and develops. But let's begin with some introductory stories and thoughts and so forth. There's a very famous mashal, which the Rebbe gives in the Siches. He quotes the previous Rebbe as having given this mashal in the Sicha. The context that the Rebbe uses is the difference between Rishonim and Achronim. And the mashal goes like this. 2 people walk into a dark room. The room is complex with much furniture and chairs and other kind of furnishings. And of course, there are a series of doors which lead you into other rooms. So you're in this very dark room and you want to get out. So of course, if you have a match, you strike the match, you can see the whole room. You have a natural sense of the perspectives of everything, meaning to say you see the relationship between the chair and the tables and the sofa and the couch and the other pieces of furnishings, and you can also identify a door. You go to the door and you leave. If a person walks into that room and doesn't have matches, so then they're forced by circumstance to tap. And they tap and tap and tap and tap and tap and tap. They encounter a chair, they encounter a table, they encounter what seems like an opening that turns out to be a window. Then they encounter a door which turns out to be a dud or goes into a closet, until they finally encounter a door that allows them to leave the room. Now, of course, the purpose of this mashal is to illustrate that when you can see things, things are very, very clear, and 2 advantages exist. Namely, you see the perspective or the relative relationship of the various different aspects found in the room, and secondly, you know exactly where the exit is. While when you're tapping, firstly, you have no sense of perspective of the relative place of the various components in the room, and you have to feel your way around. And secondly, you have to grope and grapple until you find the exit. However, there is something to be said for the tapper versus the seer. In other words, there is an advantage to one who doesn't have clarity and is forced by default to tap and tap and tap and tap, and to identify a chair, identify a table, identify a sofa and a couch and so forth, until he finds the exit. And that is that because of the darkness, because of the lack of clarity, you are forced to notice the kind of nuance, the kind of subtlety, the kind of detail that you simply would never see if you could see. It's like the difference between the blind person and the seeing person. Blind people compensate for their lack of vision with feel. And you give a blind person a pen or a piece of jewelry or even a piece of food, they will appreciate with touch, subtlety, texture, nuance that a seeing person will simply never be able to identify, because they see it directly, they see it clearly, and they see it simply. So put this mashal on a low shelf. Keep it readily accessible and available, because it is incredibly relevant to this Maamar. Second story. This is a story that happened with the Rebbe Rashab around 1887, let's say, 1888. Tov Reish Mem Zayin Mem Ches. The Rebbe Rashab was approximately 26 to 27 years old, which is young. He was, at least unofficially and in essence, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. His father had passed away, the Rebbe Marash, several years before, and though officially the Nesias didn't begin for 11 years till Reish Nandala, the end of 1893, he was the Rebbe. And he wrote a letter to a famous, relatively speaking, older chassid, someone who was twice the Rebbe Rashab's age, whose name was Reb Chaim Ber Valensky. Famous chassid, lived in Kremenchuk. He was a personality, and he was a leader, and he was a mensch. And the Rebbe Rashab wrote to Chaim Ber Valensky a letter in which he asked him questions in the sefer called Imrei Bina. Imrei Bina is considered, without a doubt, the most difficult sefer of Chassidus ever written and published by the Mittler Rebbe. It's very, very, very abstract, it's very concise, and it's very, very philosophical. The Rebbe Rashab said about himself that he lost his hair in part from his exertions in understanding the Imrei Bina. So the Rebbe Rashab wrote to Chaim Ber a letter asking him several questions about the Imrei Bina. And Reb Chaim Ber didn't respond. Not because he didn't have a response, he just felt that a Rebbe, notwithstanding his youth, needs no help from a chassid, notwithstanding his seniority in understanding Chassidus. A while later, another Kremenchuga chassid, the Kremenchuga Rav, who was also relatively young, his name was Rabbi Yitzchok Yael Rafalovich. He was older than the Rebbe Rashab, but he was, let's say, in his 30s or early 40s, traveled to Lubavitch. And he came into the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rashab tells him, I've got a problem with one of your city mates. I wrote Reb Chaim Ber a letter, and he never answered me. Now, Rabbi Yitzchok Yael Rafalovich was known for his, I guess the word is combustibility, his passion. And to him, a Rebbe writes you a letter, and you don't respond, is an incredible disrespect. So when he came home, he immediately made a beeline for Reb Chaim Ber's home, and he let him have it, and he told him in no uncertain terms how disrespectful it is that Rebbe writes you a letter and you don't answer. So the Chaim Ber, who was a man fully in control of his senses, waited for Rabbi Yitzchok Yael to vent, and then he said, tell me, by chance, did the Rebbe tell you what was in the letter? He says, no. He says, well, in the letter he asked me questions in a maimed, in Imrei Bina. He said in Yiddish, he'll manage without my help. He doesn't need my help. And Rabbi Yitzchok Yael's entire offensive immediately dwindled. He agreed. A chassid has no business answering a Rebbe such a question. This answer of Reb Chaim Ber somehow got back to the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab heard that Reb Chaim Ber had said that the reason he didn't answer him is because a Rebbe doesn't need his help, quote, Now, months later, maybe even a year later, Shavuos, it was probably Shavuos Reish Memches, this Reb Chaim Ber visited Lubavitch, came to see the Rebbe Rashab in Lubavitch. And Kedarka, he davened Bariches, he davened long, and he davened in what's called the Chabadnitze, the Cheder Sheni, the second room. And he stood in Chabad meditation, which is not just intense and deep, but probably also very peaceful, very unemotional, demonstrative on the outside. And he davened. The Rebbe Rashab walked out of the shul, maybe after he finished his own davening, walked into the Cheder Sheni, and he watched Reb Chaim Ber daven. Just watched him pray, watched him daven. And I wasn't there. Reb Chaim Ber probably wasn't shaking too hard. He was probably more in another realm, intellectually and spiritually, than his body was showing that tendency, that passion, that intensity. And he watched him, and he watched him, and he watched him. And then he commented, the Rebbe Rashab said, is gerecht, he's right. Ich hab gewollt aber sehen, sie mit Seichel allein kämen dort durchgehen. Which means in English, the reason I asked him was, I wanted to know whether one can resolve these questions that I had intellectually alone. And then he concluded that by watching Reb Chaim Ber daven, I resolved that the Rebbe Nishma Seiden, as da mit Seichel allein kon men durchgehen. You can traverse this difficult passage with intellect alone. It's a very, very meaningful story. The spirit behind the story, the meaning behind the story is that the Rebbe Rashab, in addition to being a great scholar and a great intellectual, also a holy man. Being holy has a problem. The problem is, when you study the Torah, you're not sure if you're living it or understanding it. Let me explain this to you, and this becomes the basis for the Maimah we're about to learn. According to Chassidus and Kabbalah, Torah has what's called a front and a back, a panim and a nacher, a face and a rear. The face of Torah is godly light, is Ein Sof, is godliness, which is infinite and plain. Each point in Torah is the whole Torah, the whole Torah is in each point. The Acharayim, the rear of the Torah, is the intellect, the scholarship of the Torah. if somebody can see the pnimius HaTorah, if someone can actually see the face, the godly dimension of the Torah, the achirayim, the rear, the intellectual dimension, is a byproduct. You know, if you could see the godliness in the Torah, you automatically know what the halacha is, so to speak, without a struggle. When someone is blind to the pnimius HaTorah, if you don't see the godly dimension of the Torah, that opens you up to be able to identify what is in effect achirayim, the back, the rear, the secondary dimension of the Torah, the intellectual dimension. Now on the intellectual dimension, there's an incredible amount of work. It's not easy. So what happens to a person who has Ruach HaKodesh? What happens to a person who sees the light in the Torah, but he also wants to study it and understand it intellectually? He comes across very sensitive passages and he asks himself, do I understand this or do I see this? Am I intellectually relating to this or am I experiencing the godliness, the face of it? So the only way to find that out is to ask somebody else who you know doesn't have Ruach HaKodesh, who certainly doesn't see the face of the Torah. If somebody else can intellectually understand what you understand, then you know you're also understanding it. But if nobody else can understand it, then you're not sure, is this intellectual? Has this been brought down to the level of Seichel HaTorah, which is what Torah really is, or is it on a level of Panim, Ruach HaKodesh? So the Rebbe asks a chassid to help him, not because he needs his help, but because he's not sure if he understands it or he sees it. And then the Chaim Ber doesn't answer. The Rebbe Rashab waits for him to visit, and he watches him daven, and the davening of a chassid is intellectual, not spiritual. And from the depth and the integrity of his davening, the Rebbe says, yeah, he understands. And if he understands, that means that this is Torah, this is intellectual, this is comprehensible. To give you a context, the context is, I'm going to save the details, I'll just tell you the point. The Torah has three levels. The Luches Habris, the tablets of the covenant, are kulei panim. They're only face. There's no rear. It's just light. The Torah Shebeksav, the written Torah, has what's called a panim and a achar, a front and a back. There's two dimensions. There's a dimension of Torah Shebeksav where you see the light, but there's also a dimension of Torah Shebeksav where you cannot see the light. Well, that's exactly what we experience when we open up a Sefer Torah. Torah Shebal Peh is kulei achar. Torah Shebal Peh is strictly intellectual. The Maamar we have in front of us is going to discuss only Torah Shebal Peh. It's not going to talk about the godliness of the Luches, certainly. It's not even going to talk about the godliness of Torah Shebeksav, of reading the Chumash, Mikra. It's going to talk about the relative achirayim of Mishnah versus Braisa, which, if I needed to put it in modern terms, halacha versus the process of halacha, the details of the halacha. And relatively speaking, the argument of this Maamar will be that when one studies Mishnah, although Mishnah is achirayim and Torah Shebal Peh, Mishnah is concise enough and close enough to Torah Shebeksav to have some light. Braisa, which is a secondary level, is farther away from Mikra, and therefore in Braisa there is no light at all. And the argument will finally be that studying Torah Shebal Peh, in other words, when one is in the darkness, doesn't see the light, and is forced by default to tap, as I explained to you in my first introduction, to grope around in the darkness to find clarity, they actually get to a level of depth within Torah which cannot be achieved by somebody who sees. The darkness, the lack of Ruach HaKodesh becomes advantageous. And in this particular Maamar, the darkness which is advantageous versus light is not going to be the ordinary separation between the written Torah versus the oral Torah, Torah Shebeksav versus Torah Shebal Peh, but Mishnah versus Braisa. This is the introduction. Let's now begin the Maamar. And as the Maamar unfolds, I will have further opportunity to enhance what I've shared thus far and to perhaps tell a few more stories and to enlighten this even more. But this is the introduction. Okay, so keep in mind that we're learning a Maamar about Torah Shebal Peh and about the relative levels within Torah Shebal Peh and the argument that Mishnah, the first volume, the first dimension of the writing down of the oral Torah is so close to the Torah Shebeksav that you can find light, enlightenment in it. And then there is a distinct advantage to the darkness. So the Maamar begins with a pasuk, Vayeiztei Yitzchok lasuach basada v'gomer. Yitzchok goes out in the field to suach. Suach means to talk or to pray. And as you'll see later on, to bend down. The context of this pasuk, of course, is Eliezer Eved Avraham, or as the Torah calls him, Eved Avraham, has gone to pick up Rivka. And it's a long, long story told in many, many details that happens over the course of exactly one day. how he arrives and how his animals and he are watered by Rivka, and he spends one night, he takes Rivka home the next day. As they're coming back to Eretz Yisrael, Yitzchok happens to be en route. He happens to be on the road in the direction that they're traveling. Rashi says on the previous pasuk that he had gone to find a wife for Avraham, namely Hagar. And the next pasuk says he went out into the field into the evening. And Rashi says, Vayeiztei Yitzchok l'suach basada, he went to daven mincha. And as we know that Avraham created tefillas Shachris, Yitzchak created tefillas Mincha, and Yaakov created tefillas Arvis. But our Maamar is not going to interpret Lasuach as tefillah, it's going to interpret Lasuach as Torah, and specifically bending down in as much as Torah is concerned. So Vayeiztei Yitzchok Lasuach basada, Yitzchak goes out into the field, which is far away from the city, and included in that is also the connotation of bending. We'll find out later what this means. And the Maamar completely forgets about the pasuk. The pasuk is not revisited until line 31, and then again on line 40. So the Maamar immediately gets into the issue. Vayeiztei, explaining this pasuk, requires another discussion. Dihina yesh mishno b'rais. Within Torah Shabbat itself, within the oral Torah, within the dimension of Torah where, quote, godliness is not revealed. The cherayim of Torah. You live in darkness. You cannot see divine inspiration and divine light. And as a consequence, you have to struggle with Torah Shabbat in order to have clarity about it. There's two levels, Mishnah and Braisa. Ubraisa pirush ha-Mishnah. Braisa is the interpretation of the Mishnah. Let me just give you the technical details. There was a period of Tanoim, of rabbis, which started after the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the members of the Great Assembly, which lasted around 600 years, really. The first part of it was the time of the Zuges, and then later on it, of course, was the big yeshivas and so forth. During those 600 years, nothing was written down. So the various Talmidei Chachamim and the big yeshivas taught many, many, many halachas that were recorded to memory by repetition, called Mishnahs. Finally, Rabbeinu HaKadosh in the 2nd century realized that if he doesn't write these things down, they'll be lost forever. So he wrote them down. But in the famous words of the Mishnah Torah, the Pirush HaMishnayos LaRambam, he wrote Dvarim Ktsarim Kelim Dvarim Harbe. He made the Mishnah as concise as absolutely possible. Which means to say, Rabbeinu HaKadosh had thousands and thousands and thousands of halachas. He collected the choicest, the most concise and the most inclusive, and incorporated them into the Mishnah. The rest were kept outside. That rest was written down, at least to some degree, in the next generation, by Rabbi, by Levi, by Rabbi Shia, and so forth. There were various people who wrote braises. The meaning of the word braisa means outside, namely outside of the Mishnah. So what we have, in fact, is we have something called Tosefta in the back of the Gemara, which is those braises which have reached us. So you have the halachas of the Mishnah as Rabbeinu HaKadosh crunched them together into the most concise construct of the 6 Sedorim of Mishnayos, and then you have a much more elaborate version of the same outside of the Mishnah called Braisa. So the Maamar says, Braisa pirush ha-Mishnah, Braisa interprets the Mishnah, ki ha-Mishnah hu ha-klal, because the words of the Mishnayos are klal. They generalize, they encompass much detail, but as you read it in the Mishnah, it's very, very, very broad. Braisa hi aprat shel ha-Mishnah. In the Braisas, you have many, many, many more details of the halachas found in the Mishnayos. And of course, vein bechlal elamash befrat, the Mishnah's generalization, the Mishnah's concise form incorporates all the details that are later going to be found in the Braisa, in the aspects of Torah Shabbat Peh kept outside of the Mishnah. But in the Mishnah, they're much more concise, they're much more generalized, they're much more, if you will, concealed. So the Alter Rebbe proposes, on the surface it would seem, the spiritual value and possibility within the Braisa is less than the value of the Mishnah, because it's only in reaction, a descent, a gradual lowering of the ideas in the Mishnah to be more detailed, Yossi to a lower level. And the argument, of course, is that the Mishnah is higher than the Braisa, just as we all agree that Mikra, Torah Shebeksav, is higher than Mishnah. But in the case of Mikra and Mishnah, that advantage is obvious, because Mikra is Ponim and Mishnah is Achirayim. In the Mikra you have godliness, you can experience the light of God, and in the Mishnah you can only experience the law. To a smaller degree, it's true also of the Mishnah and the Braisa. Says the Alter Rebbe, and this is the key to the Maamar, Aval ha'emesu, to be sure, Sha'braisa gavaya yesa, the Braisa is higher. The reason, the beginning of my introduction. Tapping has to do with darkness and frustration and lack of perspective and context. But it does have an advantage. You notice nuance and detail that when things are clear, you simply don't notice. It's like the person who's less intelligent and works harder than the one who is more intelligent sometimes discovers things that the superior intellect of the greater intellectual simply it went straight over his head. It went straight past him because he wasn't forced by his challenge to delve so deeply. So Torah Shabal Peh in its darkness has an advantage of Torah Shabiksav. And in this context, Braisa in its darkness has an advantage over Mishnah because the Seif Maise b'machashav atchila, what comes out at the end, in other words, the lowest level, the level of groping and grappling in the dark, was the original intent of God. And the struggle that has to do with the concealment of Torah brings us to a greater light. And he explains, Dehine, line 5. Torah has descended below to address all kinds of things. In other words, Torah doesn't remain in the mystical, esoteric realms. It has a parallel form in the physical world. When we study the Mishnah and the Talmud, we're dealing with physical matter. Of course, behind it there's some spiritual meaning, and behind that there's some godly meaning, and so forth. But as Torah descends into this world, it deals with real physical things. Afilu b'dvar sheker. Torah even addresses the question of who's telling the truth and who's lying. When two people are claiming that they both found something, someone's lying, or at least there's a possibility that someone is lying. Well, it would appear that the revealed dimension of Torah, Nigla Torah, which is called the back of Torah because it's intellect without any enlightenment, because it's addressing such ordinary things, seems to be a very, very low level of the Torah. Umekomakim, says the Rebbe, I want you to know, it's the highest. In other words, when a Yid comes into this world, struggles with Nigla de Torah, which is dealing with the lowest things, and he's on the lowest level, and dealing with the greatest darkness, he reveals aspects of truth in Torah that the higher worlds are waiting for. Their capacity to see the light blinds them from noticing this detail. And these little details are called Kisra Shel Torah, the crown of the Torah, which has the highest source. Because what comes out at the end is intended in the beginning. The famous mashal Rashi brings in Parshas told us next week. Tiferes means a tube that's opened at one end but goes in first, comes out last. So with the divine will in creating the Torah, the Pnimius HaTorah was the second idea. The first idea that Jewish people should struggle in darkness and create ideas in the darkness. Then came the face, the godly dimension of the Torah. So as we sit in this world and struggle in darkness to understand God's Torah, we're further away from the light, but closer to the purpose. And in our struggles, we reveal aspects that cannot be revealed when the lights are on, so to speak. Adam, like a human being, he was created last, and he's the point of all of them. Everything was created for him. And therefore we find that that in the entire world was ba'adam echad, one single person. Right? The Gemara brings this, and the Rambam brings it, and we all know this, that Nivra Adam Yechidi, Hashem made man alone, that we should know that one person is the whole world. Shakel Nivra Ba'avurei, all was created for him, and him in singular. Kizek Kol Ha'adam, this is all of man. And I suppose Kizek Kol Ha'adam means all of the spiritual man is that there should be a physical human being on the physical planet, studying a physical Torah in darkness, and being Mechadash Chedush. This is the first section of the Maamar. The argument is, Brais is lower than Mishnah, but it brings you to a deeper understanding, a more exact understanding, which is a higher source. And now he gives you an example for this. Everybody knows what says in Chazal. Yofa Shah Achas V'chulu, and there's a Maamar before in Parshas Chayei with this Dibra Maschel sort of. Yofa Shah Achas V'tshuva Ma'aseh B'Meila Mazeh. Yiddishkeit in this world is Yossi Mikol Chai Ha'el Mabaz, more than the world to come. Let me explain this. We do physical mitzvahs. We don't really appreciate what we're achieving. In Gan Eden, we experience the pleasure, the reward of our mitzvahs. But in Gan Eden, we experience only the reward of the kavanas ha-mitzvahs, taimei Torah, the reasons behind the mitzvahs. In Tchias HaMesim, when the resurrection of the dead occurs, we will experience the pleasure of the action of the mitzvah itself. So there's a very powerful and radical commentary from the Rebbe Marash, who says that whenever there's a law in causality, we have a cause and an effect, the cause has to be higher than the effect. If I push this table and the table moves, that makes me stronger than the table. So if my doing physical mitzvahs now is going to get me Tchias HaMesim, that means now is greater than then. So although we're going to receive reward in Gan Eden and we're going to receive reward in Tchias HaMesim, says the Mishnah, more important than any reward we'll get in the future is the existence right now. Now right now doesn't feel like fun. It certainly doesn't feel spiritual, and it certainly does not feel godly, and it certainly does not feel like you're one with God. But it's the highest. V'zehu, says the Rebbe, Maamar Azal, what the Chazal tell us, living in the physical world, doing physical mitzvah, is greater than any reward we could possibly get later. Because it's this darkness that gets us in touch with Hashem Himself. In the world to come, tzaddikim yeshu v'chulu, we're going to sit and enjoy the delight of God. Says the Rebbe, the delight of God we will experience is considered the rear. Now, I must qualify, the Acherayim here is the same as the Ponim we had before. Acherayim means Gili Elakus as opposed to Etzem of Elakus. U'kamayim, as the Pasuk says, V'ra'isa Sachayim V'geimer, Moshe Rabbeinu could only see the rear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To see the face of God in its highest form is only possible when you're one with God. So long as you're separated from Him and you're relating to Him, you can only see His light. Line 11 now. Hatainug shamasak adam, the delight that a person accesses, ba'avedasi through his service, hu b'chinas acherayim, is secondary to God Himself. Upanai, the face of God and its essence level, einei be'ef shiri lahasig, one cannot reach, kilei yirani ha'adam, a human being cannot see the face of God, v'chai, and exist as separate from God. The only way to see the essence of God is to be God, as Rasag says, to know God, you have to be God. So as long as you are relating to God, even on the highest level of reward, it's not God, that's His light. This is certainly true in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, which is a spiritual world experienced now. Line 13. It's only a ray and a shine from the truth of God Almighty. And in this world, when we do physical mitzvahs, and they don't feel like anything, we're meeting God, not godliness. And therefore, 1 hour of doing physical mitzvahs in this world is greater not only than the reward in Gan Eden, it's even greater than the reward in El Mabo. It's the deed itself, but there's a catch. B'li tainug, there's no delight, or b'li seichel, and no intellect. You know why? Because when you understand, and when you enjoy, it dazzles you. And the dazzle of understanding and enjoying prevents you from digging deeper. In this world, there isn't any delight, and there isn't any profound, easy, accessible intellect. And as a consequence, we do it with discipline, with hard work, and we reach what's called the essence. From all of the spiritual experiences, the greatest truth of God is found in this world, and specifically as we learn Torah in this world without the light. In other words, there is a very big advantage to Nigla over Nister, of a not having Ruach HaKodesh over yes having Ruach HaKodesh, namely, that when you're in the dark, you work harder and you get to the truth. And now the Rebbe goes back to the original point. V'zehu gam ken inyan Mishnah Braisa. It also explains the relative levels of Mishnah versus Braisa. And as I explained it to you before, Mishnah and Braisa are both Torah Shebal Peh, but relatively speaking, Mishnah is close enough to Torah Shebeksav to have enough light that a person with Ruach HaKodesh can experience the spirituality, and that becomes the challenge. Let me just interject a word. There was a very, very famous chassid, his name was the Radatz, the David Tzvi Chayin. He was the son of Rabbi Meir Simcha. And the Radatz used to say, that was a big gon, I'm sorry, the father of Meir Simcha. That was a very, very big gon and a very, very big chassid. He was a tzaddik. And the Radatz used to say, Ahelike Mishnah kein ein Wort nicht verstanden, which translates literally, it's a holy Mishnah, I didn't understand one single word. Now, the peripheral, the superficial meaning of that statement is that sometimes you'll learn something, and you study it, and you study it, and you study it, and you study it, and you don't understand a single word. But there's much greater depth. Mishnah has holiness. When you study Mishnah, you feel godliness, almost like when you're studying Chumash. And that's why, kein ein Wort nicht verstanden, the dazzle of the holiness of Mishnah precludes the capacity to understand it. Braisa doesn't have that feel. When you study Braisa, you don't feel holiness, and you're forced to understand, and that struggle brings you to a higher level. Says the Rebbe, the Mishnah just generalizes. That when you want to wear tzitzis, you have to have all 4 strings. The basic laws of sukkah, it's not allowed to be too big, it's not allowed to be too small. Okay? And therefore, since Mishnah generalizes so much, when studying Mishnah, although it's Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's the enlightened level of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And he says, V'yesh limtzei ta'am lazeh. You can find a reason and a delight in it. In other words, when you're learning Mishnah, you can still have a sense of godliness, of Ruach HaKodesh, which is a good thing. But that means that you're in an enlightened state and not in a darkened state. You mustn't struggle. So you're denied the incredible advantage that comes emphatically from the struggle. The reason tzitzis are made from blue wool is because blue is like the sky and so forth. The same is true. The basic mitzvah of sukkah has also the reason. You only know you're sitting in a sukkah if it's a certain height. If the sukkah is 10 stories high, you don't even realize you're sitting in a sukkah and so forth. Says the Rebbe line 18, when you study the secondary dimension of Torah Sheba'al Peh, that sense of spirituality, that sense of Ruach HaKodesh and enlightenment, which is classically associated with Torah Sheba'al and found in part in Mishnah, is not found at all in Braisa. In other words, you're in the dark. So all you have is your intellect. And your intellect means you have to struggle. And your intellect means you have to struggle, you're going to reach the highest levels. Hu prat, it's details. Levayer ha-Mishnah, to explain the Mishnah, b'chol dikdukim u'pratim, in all of its nuance and its detail. Kamei sukkahs ganvach v'rakbash. Sukkahs ganvach stands for goyim, noshim, behema, kutim. And rakbash stands for royim, kayatim, burgin, and shem risadis. You want to look it up? It's a Masechta Sukkah Chesam et Beis. She'ein tam l'davar. These details don't have explanations. And even if they have intellectual explanations, but they don't have enlightenment. When you study these particular laws and such nuance, you don't feel Ruach HaKodesh. It's just laws based on ideas. And it's very clear, the laws governing such nuances can't be explained intellectually. They certainly can't be experienced spiritually, and you have to just accept them as being super rational. That's what God wants. And you extract them by studying the words of the Psukim and the Mishnah and trying to find interpretations of every detail to come with the correct halacha, but you don't appreciate the meaning behind it. V'zehu, and this is the idea of Ein Bechlal Ela Masha Befrat, that in the Mishnah there is nothing more than you have in the Braisa. In other words, She'ein B'Mishnah Bechlal Yesem B'Prata Braisa. The Braisa has more details than the Mishnah has. And to be sure, all the details in the Braisa are rooted in the Mishnah. However, in the Mishnah you don't see those details because of the enlightenment, and in the Braisa you do because of the darkness. The fact that the nuance and the more nitty-gritty details of the Braisa are not revealed is because of Yetzer Gavaya, it's higher. The reason the flavor for mitzvahs has never been revealed, they'll revealed when Mashiach comes in the other world, when we all literally one with Hashem. 22 now. The Chazal tell us that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the greatest of the Tanoim, because of his Yidiyah Pnimiyas HaTorah, would actually give reasons for psukim. Says the Rebbe Shadarash, he would interpret Shemashanema b'pasuk Tam Shel Dover. He would say that when you study a pasuk and you can give a reason for it, you should know Lo Yizeu Ikeh. That's not the primary reason. Rak shesh tam b'zeh gavaya yiseh. There's a higher reason behind it, and L'mayla mi'atam, which is higher than the reason than you know. What it means to say is like this: when you're learning Mikra, there's panim, there's godliness. Even when you're learning Mishnah, there's some godliness. So you can give an explanation. But Rab Shimon Darash time at the Kra means Rab Shimon would say, but you should know there's a higher reason, and the higher reason we cannot know, and the higher reason only becomes accessible when we identify the little nuances of the halacha, which we only discover when it's dark. And that's represented by the idea of Brais. Nimtza, line 24, thus, shebe mitzvah, that in a mitzvah, she'ei masik batam, where there's no known reason, hu yeser gavai, it's coming from a higher space. Umashe masik tam v'tainuk, and when one does have some sense of understanding and delight in a mitzvah, hurak bechinas acherayim, it's a secondary level. Now, again, what's called here acherayim, I called in my introduction panim. It's the back of the essence of God and the face of godliness. It's contrary to what the world thinks. The most important thing is the heart that experiences delight. And serves God passionately. That's not true. The most important thing is the deed in looking for the truth. Beli tainig without any delight. V'halev einei kiyim siyua. The heart is actually a support, which is bechinas Godfinitz, the wings. So something incredible emerges. I mean, the basic issue is that there's an advantage to learning Torah Sheba'al Peh with Torah Sheba'Ksav and Nigla over Nistir. Why? Because it's dark and you're struggling. The argument here is that when a person is sensitive to the spirituality of Torah, he's rewarded. But the result of this is that his capacity to struggle in Nigla is curtailed. When a person doesn't have such enlightenment, or a person is able to put that enlightenment aside, then they're able to learn Nigla strictly, and they can reach a level of sensitivity and depth which is not available when you have that kind of Ruach HaKodesh. So, in other words, a lack of enlightenment becomes an advantage. The fact that you need to work so hard brings you in touch with Atzmas Hus. And let me tell you a couple of stories here. Number one, the Tzemach Tzedek had a brother-in-law whose name was Rabbi Yankov Cherkasser. They were both married to the Middle Rebbe's daughters. A very big tzaddik, an incredibly great tzaddik, about Ruach HaKodesh. And he had a situation once where there was a shoichet, a ritual slaughterer, accused of some kind of an aveda. And Rabbi Yankov Cherkasser saw with Ruach HaKodesh that this man is innocent. He's not guilty as charged. But all the people said they were witnesses, and therefore he should be disqualified from shechting. So Rabbi Yankov Cherkasser wrote a letter to the Tzemach Tzedek, his brother-in-law, and said, listen, you're the scholar. Show me halachically, show me using Nigla Torah, how this sheichet's accusation, the libel against him is false. So he writes a letter to his brother-in-law, sends it with the sheichet himself, and says, please use your skill in Nigla, which the Tzemach Tzedek was superior to that of Rabbi Yankov Yisrael, to expose the innocence of this man. And the Tzemach Tzedek wrote back, according to Nigla Torah, this man is guilty. So it's clear that he did this crime. The fact that you don't see it is perhaps because he washed it away with tears. Just think about that story. Here's a holy man, looks at a Jew and sees his spiritual state. He says, no, he hasn't sinned. Writes another holy man to him and says, I'm sorry, we don't determine law by holiness. We determine law by intellectual judgment, what we see with our eyes. And Nigla the Torah says he's guilty, so he's guilty. Nigla the Torah says he must be fired, so he must be displaced. What about your Ruach HaKodesh telling you that he's innocent? He did the Aveda, then he did tshuva, but that doesn't help on the level of Nigla. When a person does tshuva, you cannot reinstate him as a sheichet unless he does a special kind of tshuva, as discussed in halacha, because you have to follow your eyes. So something incredible emerges. The truth of the Torah is not the Ruach HaKodesh. The truth of the Torah is being in a state of darkness, struggling with it, not having clarity, and finding your conclusions based on intellect alone. Which leads me to another beautiful commentary. There was a very, very great chassid whose name was Rabbi Isaac Homler, Rabbi Isaac of Hommel. His last name was Epstein and he was a Levi. And Rabbi Isaac Homler once said about the three Rabbeim that he served and knew, the Alter Rebbe, the first, the Middle Rebbe, the second, the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third, the following statement. The Alter Rebbe had Ruach HaKodesh always, the Middle Rebbe had Ruach HaKodesh when he wanted, and the Tzemach Tzedek had Ruach HaKodesh from time to time. And he concluded, quote, Amol is beser, nicht haben Ruach HaKodesh. There's advantages to not be divinely inspired. So of course the Tzemach Tzedek's Chassidim were very insulted. How come he put their Rebbe on a lower level? So they began to criticize him. One Chassid said to him, to Rabbi Isaac, who are you? Do you have Ruach HaKodesh, that you're an expert on Ruach HaKodesh? And Rabbi Isaac said, Ruach HaKodesh hab ich nicht, aber am Meiven bin ich. I don't have divine inspiration, but I'm an expert. But the important part of the story is that comment. Sometimes you don't want Ruach HaKodesh, because Ruach HaKodesh puts you in a position that you're not sure if you understand it. And Torah is only Torah when you understand it intellectually. And that's the advantage of Brais over Mishnah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, Torah Sheba'Ksav. The darkness gets you to a level of truth of God's wisdom that's unavailable when you're dazzled by light and inspiration and spirituality. So the Tzemach Tzedek is able to reach a level of truth of Torah Sheba'al Peh precisely because his Ruach HaKodesh is not always on. And that's really the meaning behind that story. The Rebbe Rashab asked Reb Chaim Ber if he understands, because only if Reb Chaim Ber understands, the Rebbe Rashab knows he also understands, because he's in the light. And here a very, very important clarification must be introduced, and that is, Torah Torah Sheba'al Peh has incredible advantages over Torah Sheba'Ksav. As described, when you don't see, you have to struggle, and when you struggle, you find the truth. But there's a very important qualifying criteria, and that is you have to want the truth. In other words, when one is learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, the most important quality is bittul. It's more important in learning Torah Sheba'al Peh than in learning Torah Sheba'Ksav. When you're learning Kabbalah, Pnimiyas HaTorah, dimensions of Torah that give you spirituality, the spirituality humbles you. The spirituality, so to speak, at least in some cases, keeps you where you're supposed to be. When you're learning strict Nigle, Mishnah, Braisa, Talmud, it's totally an intellectual experience. And there's a great intensity and struggle and so forth. And of course, what is the equilibrium in all of that? What justifies all that? The human ego. The human ego offsets integrity. So the missing link in this is that when one is learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, and the Alter Rebbe says he reaches a level of truth which exceeds that of one who sees the light in Torah Sheba'Ksav, and even the lesser lights, but lights still, in Mishnah, is that you learn the Torah with such a desire for the truth and such a respect for the idea that this is not just a man-made book, but that this is a divinely inspired book. And therefore there's infinity, there's true wisdom, infinite true wisdom. And this Torah is the prerequisite for it. Because if you learn Torah Shalei Lishma, all bets are off. And that's the challenge in Torah Sheba'al Peh. That when you're learning Nigle, it's the deepest level of finding truth. But you have to preserve that you should learn it in a way that you're thinking about God, and that it should be, as the Gemara says, Sam Chayim and not Sam Amav, a potion of life and not a potion of death. Which is why we learn Chassidus. The learning of Chassidus now is not for the sake of the Chassidus. It's to keep the Nigla honest. We learn Chassidus to have a sense of godliness so that when we're struggling in Nigla the Torah, which is really what we're supposed to be doing for the most part, it has integrity, it has emes. And now the Maamar continues. Line 27. Let me just say this. All of us have learned Ani Liadi, I reckon. In other words, we're all familiar with the famous analogy of the king in the field. And of course, the Maamar Ani Liadi, the king in the field, divides reality up into three stations. A city, a field, and a desert. A desert is a place of sin. A city is a place of spiritual sophistication. And the field is a place of spiritual survival. And the idea of the king visiting the field means he's going away from the sophisticated spiritual beings and engaging with the ordinary survivalist beings. And it says in that Maamar Ani Liadi, he doesn't visit the desert. The people in the desert, in other words, those who've sinned, Uvikashta Mishan, have to find their way out of it from within it. So our Maamar now says, line 27, V'hinei Mishnah Nikra Ir. According to this Maamar, that even though Mishnah is Torah Sheba'al Peh, it's oral Torah, because it's so general and basic, there's enough light in it for you to see reason. It's the city. It's the sophisticated dimension. It's closer to godliness. U'braisa b'chinas sada. The braisa, where there isn't that enlightenment and that sophistication, there's a rigid, there's a dry struggle to find the truth strictly intellectually, is like a field, lashon bar. The word braisa means bar, outside, chutz le'ir, outside of the city. So directly, the people of the city are sophisticated. The people of the field are grappling in the dark. But that darkness has its advantage as well. The argument is that ha'ir ikir, who ikir, the most important place is the city, shadaram babnei adam, people live there, and in the spiritual context, those who are sensitive to godliness live there. Okay? Says the Maamar, however, nira mi mechaya isam, who gives who life? Mi hu mechaya isam. Who feeds who? The city doesn't feed the field. The field feeds the city. City folk need bread. And without bread, all their diamond cutting and all their sophisticated weaving and kneading and architecture is meaningless. So Braisa, the field, may not experience an enlightenment, but it provides the staple because it gets to the heart and the essence. Hasadeh shechutz le'ir, the field outside of the city, shemaviyim misham atvor, that's where nourishment comes from. Says the Rebbe, kachu Braisa, the same is true also in this context. The level of Torah Sheba'al Peh called Braisa outside, where there is no trace of enlightenment, which is classic of Torah Sheba'Ksav. Mechaya Mishnah gives life and vitality to the Mishnah, where there is some spirituality. Umeva'eres halacha yesed. It brings out the details of the practical side of the law, which is total darkness. But in this total darkness, there is the real highest and truest will of Hashem. Yesed, even more befrat in detail. Hey, class us how to do it. And as the Gemara says, there's the Gemara Masechta Baba Metzia that says that if a person determines law from the Mishnah, he's destroying the world. Why? Because the Mishnah is too general. And because the Mishnah is too general, it's impossible to determine what's the correct law in every individual case. Or to say it mystically, in the Mishnah there's divine light. And the divine light overwhelms, it dazzles the world. The world being Eilam Lashon Helam. Hashem wants the lights to be dimmed and diminished and concealed. And we should struggle. And we should find the truth. That's Golus, that's Torah Or, that's Braisa. And now the Maamar goes full circle. V'zehu Vayeiztei Yitzchok l'suach basadeh. Yitzchok is going to do his work in a field. And as you'll see in a few moments, he's going to do his work in a field as the sun is setting, lifneis erev, as it's getting dark. The spirit of this pasuk is enlightening the idea of Yitzchok. Yitzchok's purpose is not to exist and enjoy the light, but to descend to where it's dark and struggle and find a level of depth and integrity and detail which cannot be found when one is enlightened. So the Rebbe translates that the word lasuach or lashon dibur, v'sichat, means to speak, but it also means lashon shchiyah, to bend lamata down. Like the pasuk says, milashon v'shachru manashim, to lower the heights of men. V'chein, the second pasuk is kashiyefarash hashucha lichches, when one bends. Skip the parenthesis. So the idea is Yitzchok is not going lasuach to speak, but to lower himself. He lives in a world of light and enlightenment, which is wonderful. But he wants to be able to find the subtleties of the Torah Or, which is really the essence of God, because it affects how we do mitzvahs practically. He has to step out of the light. Like the Tzemach Tzedek's turning off his Ruach HaKodesh, or not having Ruach HaKodesh, to have a sense of Amitasa, of Torah Or, which would be unavailable to him if he was enlightened. For Lifneis Erev, and it's done as the sun is setting. Lifneis Erev HaCheshech, as it's getting evening and dark. The Hinei and the Alter Rebbe explains. HaTeira nishtal shlo b'cheshech, Teira descended into darkness. K'maamar, as it says in the pasuk, and of course this is quoted so often by the Rebbe, b'machshakim hayshivani. It says a pasuk in Eiv, you have placed me in darkness, says the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli. This is the Babylonian Talmud. There's an interesting thing. The Babylonian Talmud is considered lower than the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is considered relatively enlightened, and yet halacha Bavli. We follow the laws of the Bavli. We say that Bavli's need to grope and grapple in the dark gives an added integrity to their Torah. Shenishtal shalamata, the Torah Shebal Peh and Bavli descends so low, afilu b'sheket, even into darkness. V'lama hukach, why does Torah Shebal Peh, why does the lower levels of Torah deal with such lowly things? K'dei lefanes ha'erev ha'cheshech, to transform the evening and the darkness, vayihiyeh, to make it into light. K'maamar, as it says, I think this is a pasuk, la'eis erev yihir, you have to make from the darkness light. And the only way you do this is to descend into the darkness. K'moshe, like for example, if you want to move something, you must enter into it. To move it and change it. And of course, you don't want to remain there permanently, you want to remove it. Similarly, when a person wants to find the darkness of this world and to bring into it the Torah which descends into the level of darkness, to transform that darkness onto the light, you have to descend into that world. Also the idea that Torah has descended. V'neslapsha, and manifest or enclosed itself, b'cheshech, in darkness, tainus sheker, arguments of falsehood, you struggle with the darkness and ultimately you replace it. To make the darkness into light. And this highest dimension of light, which is only accessible through the struggle of Torah Shebal Peh, which is, so to speak, the silver lining to the cloud of Golus, and Bayesheni, and Machlaikis, and Talmidim Shalashim called Tarkan, and all the rest, brings you to the highest light, which will be revealed only when Mashiach comes. The same is true in one study is Torah. Litchais, to push away ha'choshech v'ha'kushis, the darkness and the questions that are the result of the entanglement. Hamastir, which blocks alaskolas hadin, over understanding the law, and ha'emes la'amiti, to find the absolute truth. Consequently, v'limtzei ha'emes, to find the truth, which is gili ratzon aliyim baruch hu, which is revelation of the will of God, comes from struggling with the darkness. It says in Chassidis, al posek v'hamaskilim yazhidu v'gemer. Maskilim yazhidu k'zeira rekia. In other words, in the night, you don't have the sun and the moon, and you have the stars, so it's dark. but ultimately you have the rays, the light that comes from the darkness itself. And let me share with you another concept here. There's a Maamar called Tzamach Vov, right? In 05, 06, 07. The Rebbe Rashab said a discourse which is 63 sections. It's over 500 pages. And one of the basic structural designs of that Maamar is the question of Ben and Eved, the son versus the servant. And the interpretation mystically is that a son is somebody who's enlightened, spiritually close to God, which is incredibly advantageous. What we call the Neshama Vatzilas. Eved, specifically in Eved Pashat, a simple servant, is someone who's like us, with a major Yetzer Hara, not very spiritually motivated, living in darkness, spiritually speaking, and therefore everything we do is not motivated by enlightenment and spirituality, but by discipline. God gave us mitzvahs and we accept them. And the Tzamach Vav swings like a pendulum, back and forth. Which is greater? Are you closer to God if you're spiritually inspired like a Ben, or are you closer to God if you spiritually struggle like an Eved? And concludes that Eved is higher than Ben. That when one is a slave and serving God with a simple discipline, without an enlightenment, they're closer to the truth, to God Himself, than when one is enlightened. But then the Tzamach Vav has a new idea, a creative idea, which is mentioned in Tanya chapter 41. And that's called Ben Shenasa Eved. How can a son become a slave? Which means, how can a very enlightened person, a spiritually sensitized person, achieve the advantage of the simple Jew who serves God with a Kabbalah Seil and a Biddle? And the answer is when you paskin halachas. When you study not Torah, but you study law. Because when one is studying halachas ha-Torah, what is the predominant emotion? Not delight, not joy, not pleasure, fear. You're afraid of making a mistake. Because you know that on the basis of the halacha, you're going to determine people are going to behave accordingly, and if you give them a wrong halacha, calamity can happen. So as brilliant as you are, and as sensitized as you are, you don't want to have to determine the law, the halacha, to be a rov. And when you do, as enlightened as you are, all that enlightenment is quieted. All that pleasure, all that joy is secondary. Right now you're filled with the trepidation and the responsibility of paskening. So then the most enlightened person is successfully putting aside his enlightenment to intellectually focus on the Torah in a way that it's a struggle, not a struggle because it's hard for him to understand, but it's a struggle for him out of fear that he's going to make a mistake. And that adds to him, to this very spiritually sensitized person, the humility necessary that allows him to find these secrets into the Torah that would otherwise not be available to him. And in this Maamar, it's the Braisa versus the Mishnah. And now the Maamar concludes. This is the last paragraph of the Maamar. V'zehu, and this is what the Maamar pasuk means when it says Vayeiztei Yitzchok l'suach. Yitzchak goes out. Yitzchak, Isaac, goes out of an environment of enlightenment, l'suach, to descend to the place of darkness, to struggle and to find a higher truth. If you're going to overturn the evening, the darkness, and correct it, you need Yitzchak. Why? Because Yitzchak's midah is gevura, strength. And strength involves fear. It's fear. Enlightened people are not afraid of God, they love Him. Yitzchak is a very enlightened man, but he has the capacity to step away from that enlightenment. Activate his attribute of fear, being afraid of making a mistake. How could you be afraid of making a mistake if you're so spiritually enlightened? And the answer is you step out of it. You'll never get the truth of the wisdom of Torah unless your predominant emotion is fear and not love. This is why the Mishnah says, if one says, I only have Torah, he doesn't have Torah either, he remains in darkness. The meaning of this is that Torah means enlightenment. And if you say, my religion, my Yiddishkeit is enlightened, you don't even have enlightenment. If you have an element of yira and struggle, that gives credibility, that proves that whatever spirituality and enlightenment you have has some credibility. Avo be'emes ksiv. V'nisha b'choshech, he remains in the darkness. Avo be'emes, the truth is, ksiv yashes cheshech sisrei, the highest truth is in the darkness itself. Sha'af shu cheshech, it appears dark, v'komok emusisrei, the great secret of God is there. And this is why lifneis erev, you want to change the evening, v'acheshech, and the light, or le'eis erev yihi ya'oir, to make darkness into light, v'hainu liben hilchas, and this is clarifying the law. Okay. And let me just tell you one more story, which is also quite familiar. The Rebbe has told the story numerous times. There was once an occasion where the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, said a Maamar, a Chassidic discourse. And afterwards, the Chassidic discourse was reviewed by the great Chassidim, the Tzemach Tzedek's children and all the others, and a huge disagreement erupted. They were arguing about the interpretation of a particular thought. And it was like everybody against one. Everybody said one thing, and the great Chassid, the Hillel of Parshas, had a different perspective. And he refused to concede even to the Tzemach Tzedek's own sons. He was a very great Chassid. The decision was reached that they would consult the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and ask him. He said the Maamar, let him give his opinion. So they presented the question to the Tzemach Tzedek. They offered him both views, but of course they did not tell him who said which. And the Tzemach Tzedek sided with his sons, not with the Hillel Parshas. So they turned to the Hillel Parshas and said, well, are you willing to concede now? And Hillel says, no, I stand by mine. And they told him that that's ridiculous. You're arguing about the meaning of a Maamar against the person who recited the Maamar. And the Hillel says, you must understand. This is one of the most beautiful insights. When a Rebbe speaks Chassidus, those are the words of God coming through his lips. Then he has to study like anybody else. People says, I'm not saying that Tzemach Tzedek is wrong. He understands it as he sees it. I understand it as I see it. Within the Tzemach Tzedek's own words, as they were spoken as a divinely inspired truth, now on an intellectual dimension, it can be split. And I'm not going to back away from my position because I think my position has credibility. And that's really the intriguing thing here, is in Seichel HaTorah you squeeze out much, much more that exists in the Ruach HaKodesh of Torah. And the Maamar concludes, V'gam zeh pirish baruch HaTorah. This is what the Gemara says, that it's critical, not just to study Torah, but bless the Torah. And the Gemara says the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed for a failure to bless the Torah, and it's interpreted in Sfarim that this means a failure to connect the Torah to God. In other words, when you are learning the Torah, you have to learn it with a humility, and this is especially true when you're learning the oral Torah and the Braisa, where the light is gone. And that humility connects you to God and allows you to reach the truth of God's Torah that you wouldn't reach otherwise. So now I'm going to summarize and conclude it all. This Maamar is based on a pasuk. The pasuk says, Vayeiztei Yitzchok lasuach basada lifnei zerev. Yitzchok went out of the city into the field to speak towards evening. Interprets our Maamar. Yitzchok went away from his place of enlightenment and delight to descend into a place of darkness, to transform the darkness into light. Understanding that in that darkness, he'll have to work harder. He'll find a greater truth and enlighten it. And the condition is that you have to have a humility. The context of the Maamar is explaining that pasuk, not using Torah Shebaksav and Torah Shebapeh as is typically the model in Chassidus when talking about enlightenment versus darkness, but by talking about Mishnah and Gemara, two dimensions of Torah. Mishnah and Braisa, two dimensions of Torah Shebapeh itself, and arguing that Mishnah has a little bit more light. And I believe that this is the correct interpretation of the famous words of the Radatz, a heilige Mishnah, kein Wort nicht verstanden, that I mentioned before. A heilige Mishnah because Mishnah still has oil, like Torah Shebaksav, as opposed to a Braisa.